Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. It must have been about 6 years ago that I read Goethe's Faust for the first time. And I'm going to be honest with you, I was completely baffled by it. I had read Shakespeare, I had read Dante, Cervantes, many of these great authors, and I was just completely in awe of them. I had also read The Sorrows of Young Werther, by Goethe also, and I absolutely loved that text. But I knew that it was Faust that was considered to be one of the greatest masterpieces, if not the greatest, depending on who you ask, of German literature. Now, after reading it, I honestly was not able to tell. I could not understand why, if my friends from Germany will pardon me here for a second. So it was one of those cases where I told myself, Jorge, there's obviously something wrong with you here. Okay, it's one of those cases in which the work is judging you as opposed to you judging it. Or maybe it's one of those cases in which a lot has been lost in translation. So I told myself, someday you have to give this obviously great work of literature a chance once again. So I just did that, and this time I read it in a different translation, and the results were much better. So I wanted to share with you my experience rereading Goethe's Faust, or maybe as I consider it, reading for the first time, because I don't feel I could really count my previous experience as a really good reading experience here. So since I mentioned the different versions that I have read, let me tell you a little bit about that first, because in this case this is really important. So the first time that I read Faust, I went with the Bayard Taylor translation or version, whatever you want to call it, which is published or was published by the Modern Library. Now, this is a version that actually adheres to the meter, to the original meter that you will find in Goethe. So just because of that, it's really quite a feat, but at the same time, because of that, it is also a little bit forced at times, especially when it comes to the rhyme. It sounds a little bit archaic. And it was only recently, I don't know why, because the date is included here, that I found out that this translation is from 1870 and 1871. So it's been quite a while, and that really explains a lot, you know. But at the moment, I didn't realize that, and I read it. And I enjoyed it to some extent, but once again, you know, it was a really, really rough reading experience. Now, for my reread, I decided to go with the translation or the version by David Constantine. And I'm going to show you the cover real quick. It's from the library, so it's covered with stickers. I don't really know why they have to do that sometimes. But this one has been published by Penguin. And the reason why I wanted to show you the cover is so that you can recognize the book by the cover, because there are different translations also within the Penguin collection of classics. So this is the one that I have read. The cool thing about this one, and this is something that David Constantine says in his translator's introduction, he says that he is not a mimetic translator. He says that he favors effect over means, and you can really tell. One way in which I see this is, for example, that he will include rhymes, right? But he's not going to force them. So that way it doesn't sound like you're reading something that is really constrained by those ideas of adhering like very, very specifically to the meter and the rhyme. It is much more flexible. So let me give you a little bit of information about Faust, just some general stuff. And as you probably know, the story of Faust is not original to Goethe. Okay, just to give you an example, in English we have this great play by Christopher Marlowe, Dr. Faustus, which I highly recommend to you. This was my first experience of the Faust legend or myth, and I enjoyed it very much. This is actually one of my favorite plays. But I think even if you consider that this is not, theoretically speaking, an original story, it is still really important that Goethe decided to revisit this character at the moment that he did, because Faust in Goethe's hands is really a modern hero, and that is one of the reasons why he is considered to be such an important character in the history of literature. He represents the disillusionment, right? The despair, the restlessness, the always desiring for more that I think is inherent to the human condition. Now, as you know probably too, because I showed you two books before, Goethe's Faust was published in two parts. We have part one, which was published in 1808, and then the second part was published posthumously in 1832. But here's the interesting thing. The actual composition of this great work took almost 6 decades. And it really depends on who you ask when the beginning of it took place. But some people say 1771, 1773 to the year 1832, which was, right up to the last moments of Goethe's life. So he really dedicated much, if not most, of his life to the composition of this work. Now, when it comes to genre, okay, since we're talking in general here about Faust, is this a play? Is it a poem? Is it an epic? The answer, of course, is all of the above in this case. We're going to see that Faust really is an all-encompassing work in many levels, okay, at many levels of the writing and the composition. So there's one thing that critics have been pointing out for years when it comes to Faust, and that is this notion that the work is problematic in its structure, that it has a little bit of a messy structure, that it lacks unity. This is something that has once again baffled many readers for a very long time. And the fact is that Faust is really an extravagant, exorbitant text, okay? It's a text that seems to be saying, I am not cohesive, so leave behind all your preconceived notions of what this type of literature should be. I have, or I am, even better, my own structure, so just get over it and try to enjoy this text. So personally, I would describe Faust as a centrifugal text, okay? This is a text that explodes all over the place. And just so you know, it really baffled its contemporaries as much as it may confuse us, So this is something that comes with the territory when you are exploring this great play, great poem, great epic by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And I think much of its greatness really lies precisely in that quality of exploding all over the place, the centrifugal nature of this text. So one of the reasons, as I suggested before, why Faust may seem a little bit messy in its structure is because we have here a work that is really all-encompassing. It's a work that is trying to cover as much of the realm of poetry as it possibly can. So there are many poetic forms, like all kinds of meters that you're going to find within this work, because that's what Goethe does. He really tries to encompass everything. And I think it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Faust is kind of an encyclopedia of poetry in itself. So as a result, if, as we were saying before, poetry is what is lost in translation, then there is really much that is lost here when you translate it from German into other languages. Much more, I would say, than maybe is lost in the translation of Don Quixote, even though, in a work like that, there is also a lot to be lost. I have experienced both versions, in Spanish and in English, and I can tell you that that is definitely the case. It's always the case, no matter what kind of translation you are looking at. Now, going back to the idea of all-encompassing, right? Throughout the work, Goethe really changes the meter so that the form and the content fit each other. But here's one very important thing to keep in mind. Sometimes he does that in an ironic way. One example that I can give you is in Act 4 of Part 2, which is an act that has a lot to do with war and with conflict. We're going to explore it a little bit in detail in a few minutes. He uses Alexandrines. So those are generally used in a heroic way, right, to exalt the combat and the war. But in this case, he uses Alexandrines in order to paint an unheroic portrait of war. So that's what I meant when I said be careful, because he will change the meter so that the form fits the content, but sometimes he's doing that ironically. So it's part of the greatness of the work too. But I think, still talking about this idea of the all-encompassing nature of Faust, it's really important to consider also that that doesn't happen only in the context of form, because Goethe, what he did with this work was to simply just put everything in it. I mean everything. And he draws from all kinds of tradition in order to compose this work. So in Faust, you're going to find the classical and the modern, the pagan and the Christian. You're going to find myth and history, the visual arts and literature. All of these things are here. So this is an explosive mix, okay? It's really a bubbling cauldron that we're dealing with here. Now, I want you to listen to a critic, Jane Brown, okay? She has a really interesting way of describing Faust, and I'm getting this from the Cambridge Companion to Goethe. She has an essay on Faust, precisely in this book. And she says, Faust is a comprehensive synthesis of European culture, and as such is largely responsible for the widespread perception that Germany in the 19th and early 20th centuries had reached the pinnacle of cultural development. Let me repeat that first part again. Faust is a comprehensive synthesis of European culture. So that is quite a way to describe this work. So you ask yourself, okay, the structure seems a little bit messy. No wonder. I mean, what we have here is really a pastiche, way before postmodernism, of course. So it's really not a surprise, okay, that the structure has confused or bemused some critics throughout time, really. Now, a little bit of context, okay? As you know, when you're dealing with these great works of literature, these timeless works that are part of the canon, whether you agree with that or not, most of the time what we have are works that were published, even if this seems a little bit simplistic, in the right place at the right time. And I want to emphasize the time aspect here. They're timely works, right? So here's Brown once again. I want to share with you another part of her essay, because I think this pretty much nails the idea of context. So Jane Brown says, Faust comprehends far-reaching changes in philosophy, science, political and economic organization, industrialization and technology that might best be summarized as Europe's confrontation with the impact of secularization. Europe entered the 18th century with institutions and structures still defined in terms of a cosmos ordered by a divine principle, but increasingly the universe was felt to operate on its own and sometimes seemed entirely the product of natural processes. I think that pretty much gives us the best description that we can have of the context in which this work appeared. We are in a world of changes. And in other words, what you could say about Faust is that it really captured the zeitgeist. Okay, and this is something that of course you can say about most great, if not all, the great works of literature, that they consciously or unconsciously are able to capture that spirit of the time. And I definitely think that Faust fits the description right here. So, is Faust based on a true story? That is something that people ask themselves sometimes, and it just so happens that yes, there was a historical Johann Faustin, according to one of my sources, who lived in the 15th century. And his story, the history of Faust, was basically a cautionary tale about the dangers of these excessive desire for knowledge, for example. This is what we see clearly in this play or in this poem, though that knowledge also represents something else. We're also going to talk about that very briefly. You could extend that idea of the desire for knowledge to the desire for power, okay, if knowledge is power, as somebody said a long time ago. So this idea, of being punished for not staying in your place is something that is really consistent with fables, for example. You find that all over the place. There are many fables in which the basic idea is that, just stay in your place. Don't try to be too much, don't try to fly too high or you may fall, etc., etc. And it is also consistent with the story of Adam and Eve. So you can see why this story of Faust has resonated with so many people. It is really something that seems to be ingrained in our condition. And in this case, of course, Faust really lets this desire for knowledge lead him to make a pact with the devil, which is a really bad idea, as you may know. So traditionally, if you look at the stories of Faust, he is condemned, okay? But in Goethe's version, he is saved, according to some critics, problematically, okay? So we're also going to talk about that. I'm promising a lot here. I hope that I can, fulfill all those promises. So, first of all, let's do this. Let's explore Faust a little bit. Let's look at the work, Volume 1 and Volume 2, a little bit at least, just so we can have an idea of what we're dealing with. So if you look at the first one comes with a lot of prolegomena, I would say, like a lot of previous stuff before the actual work begins. We have a dedication that is a poem, then we have a prelude in the theater, after that we have a prologue in heaven. And here in the prologue in heaven there is a little bit of an echo, or many echoes I would say, of the story of the book of Job, right, in which the devil is given permission to test a good human being. And then after that we have the actual beginning of the story. And the story famously begins with Faust despairing of the limitations of human knowledge. Okay, he has read everything, he has studied everything, and the question is, now what? Okay, it's kind of like that feeling after you graduate from college. You know, you find yourself in that situation. That is kind of what Faust is going through. It's basically restlessness, right? This restlessness that is just inherent to the human condition. If you ask me, and if you ask other people and other philosophers, there's really no way out of it. It's part of the very experience of being human, as for example Saint Augustine said, you know, we are restless, or our hearts are restless until they rest in God. You can agree or disagree with the second part of that, but regarding the restlessness, I think we can all agree on that. And as a matter of fact, you know, I'm going to say that Faust, I believe, should have read Saint Augustine. He would have saved himself a lot of trouble. So, you know, just saying. But anyway, Faust's first exchange is with a certain Wagner. Okay, and this guy Wagner represents the mediocre scholar. He's a guy who has just no use for nature. For example, he says that all he needs are his books. If he has his books, then he's fine. So you can imagine him like just you know, with his head just inside whatever it is that he happens to be reading at the time. And Faust himself is really held in high esteem by the people, by the townspeople. You know, his father was a doctor too, so he helped these people in their time of sickness and their time of need. So he's really well regarded. Now one day, Faust and Wagner are going back home, and Faust sees this dog, and he is deeply troubled by this dog for some reason that he doesn't understand. Wagner just looks at the dog and he's like, hey, come on, it's just a dog, you know, no big deal. So they decide to take the dog home. And once they are there, it just so happens that the dog is really not a dog. So Faust was right. This is none other than the devil Mephistopheles. So that is how the whole thing gets started. Faust soon makes a pact with Mephistopheles because he wants to have some kind of a superior experience. Okay, and to describe this, I'm going to borrow the title of one of Peter Handke's novels, or short novels, or novellas. A moment of true being. That is in a way what Faust is looking for. Then they go to a witch's house, and in this house Faust sees this beautiful image, this image of it's kind of like a reflection of a beautiful woman, and he just has to have her. Okay, so what happens is that he projects that reflection onto the next girl, the very next girl that he sees, and that just happens to be a certain Margareta, or Gretchen, okay, the famous Gretchen of part 1 of Goethe's Faust. So Faust pursues her, he eventually ruins her, but then towards the very end of this play or poem or epic, what he does is that he does his best to save her. So there's a little bit of a development right there. Now, just so you know, compared to part 2, the first part of Faust is really quite simple and straightforward, really. So that may be one of the reasons why you read it and you think, okay, so where is the greatness here? Part 1 is really focused and is quite subjective too. So the story really is moved by just this desire for more, right? And it's a desire for more wisdom, which could be tied to power, right? For more knowledge, but also for more experience. Because remember that Faust is looking for that moment of true being, if we might call it that. And that is a desire, of course, that leads Faust to a bad choice. And after that, it's just one negative action, one wrong action after the other. So in a sense, what the first part of Faust does is to trace a type of downward spiral with this character. Now, this leads us to the second part. And just as an introduction to the second part, I want to share with you something that the translator, David Constantine, said, because I think this really nails the difference between part 1 and part 2. He says that part 2 is less a continuation than an explosion, okay, an explosion of the premises and the structures of part 1. So I think that is really the best way to look at it, instead of as, you know, Faust part 2. It's really something quite different. This second part is a little bit longer. It is also divided into 5 acts, something that we don't really have in the first part. And in this part, I would say necessarily, Faust, the character, doesn't really remember what happened in part 1. Okay, I think that is almost something that Goethe had to do. So you can see also what David Constantine means when he says this is not really a continuation. Okay, it's something different. It's almost like a second version, but with different characters, different situations, and many differences all over the place. So in the beginning of part 2, Faust and Mephistopheles are part of the court. They are entertaining the character of the emperor, very important character in the second part that represents power. And they entertain him. They also fix the economy for him. You know, there are changes there in the economic system with the appearance of money, you know, paper money and all that stuff. And that is reflected at this beginning of the second part of Faust. So at one point, the emperor says, I want to see Paris and Helen. Okay, these two characters from Greek mythology or history, depending on who you ask. So Helen here is going to be the key figure of this second part of Faust. We had Gretchen in the first one, and now we have Helen, and it's really interesting to compare those two. So Faust sees Helen, and guess what happens? Of course, he is smitten, he must have her, just like it happened with Gretchen. So he hasn't learned that much really, but remember, he doesn't remember the events of part 1, so maybe this is what is going on right here with him. After that we have Act 2, in which Faust and Mephistopheles travel to Greece. But there's really something really interesting that happens here, and it is this. Faust, the character, seems to almost recede into the background for a while in the second part. And the important question here becomes, you know, whether Mephistopheles is, at least at points, a more interesting character than Faust himself. I mean, I'll let you decide that. But in this second act of part 2, we see for the first time a very important, very interesting character by the name of Homunculus. Okay, Homunculus is a kind of a test tube human being that was actually created by Wagner, the character, our mediocre friend from part 1 of the poem or the play. And Homunculus is a human-like figure that just has this desire for life. He wishes to come into being. So you can see what is happening here. We have a parallel search. We have on the one hand Faust looking for love in the form of Helen, and then on the other hand we have this Homunculus that parallels Faust in many ways, and what he's looking for is just for life, for a complete human life, just as Faust was in part 1, looking for that moment of true being. So that is Act 2 of the second part. After that, in Act 3, what we see here is the union between Faust and Helen, but it is presented as a play within the play. And it just so turns out that the one who is staging this play is Mephistopheles. So we have quite a distance, there from the events and the way in which they are presented. And one way to interpret this, right, this marriage, is as the union between antiquity, represented by Helen, and modernity, represented by Faust. And I think this is a really good moment, actually, to bring up something that I thought was really interesting. And that is the fact that Carl Jung actually listed Helen as one of the 4 manifestations of or the 4 stages of the anima. The anima, that part of the human psyche that represents the feminine principle. So the 4 stages or the 4 manifestations are Eve, Helen, Mary, the Virgin Mary, and then the final one, which Jung called Sophia. Okay, so we go from the most carnal in Eve to the most ethereal, if you want to call it that, with Sophia. So notice how Helen happens to be the second one. So there is a physical attraction definitely present there, but it is also already showing some kind of a more intellectual type of appeal. So that is how Jung perceived her. Then we have Act 4. Okay, and this one is marked by war, by conflict, as I mentioned before. But it is not really a heroic portrayal of war. Goethe is quite critical of war based on his own personal experience at that time. And then after that, of course, we have Act 5. And this one begins with a very strange scene that doesn't seem to belong with the rest of the play, okay, because we see the scene at a cottage that belongs to a couple, an elderly couple. But soon after that we meet Faust again, and he is very, very old. He's extremely grumpy at this point. He is at this point the master of everything except for the elderly couple's estate. So he's like, I need to have that because it's the only thing that I'm missing. It's like the 99-cent syndrome. You don't think about the 99 cents. You think about the 1 cent that you're missing so that you can have $1, right? So he's like, I want to have this estate. I need it, okay? And guess who's going to help? Mephistopheles, of course. So a prominent theme that you can see here is obviously this the insatiable nature of power, right? This desire for power that is never satisfied. And that is something that maybe you could connect to colonialism, to imperialism. Once again, we're living in a changing world at the time that Faust was published. So maybe it's a connection there with that. And then at the very end of the play, quite abruptly, Faust is just spirited away to heaven by a group of angels. And this is the part that I was telling you before that has been problematic to some critics, to many critics, actually. It has really provided a lot of food for criticism. Goethe's Faust, once again, is notorious because he changed the ending of the traditional story, right? In his version, Faust is saved, really, but in a very problematic way, so that you have to ask yourself, is this an ironic type of ending that we're dealing with here? This idea that Faust all of a sudden is saved? Because honestly, from what I read, I could tell that critics do not even agree as to whether Faust changes or not, whether he deserves to be saved or not, for example. Does he develop morally throughout the play, or does he remain as self-centered as he was at the beginning? And critics do not agree on this. Some say, yeah, he develops, he becomes better morally. Others say, no, he's just the same character, so he doesn't deserve to be saved. I want to read you something that the critic Liselotte Diekmann actually said about this in her study of Faust and of the works of Goethe. The question here is, how can a man be saved against the logic of the legend who has done a great deal of wrong and no real good? This, she says, is the question that many critics ask themselves. And this is an answer that she provides. The only conceivable answer must be that the kind of redemption presented in the last scene has nothing to do with the problem of good and evil. Faust is obviously saved, there are quotation marks here, despite his evil deeds and without any form of repentance. The work considers the existence of evil as an unavoidable and necessary part of life. This does not mean that evil is easily excused. On the contrary, the emphasis on its existence and its terror is great. But it does mean that the work is directed toward life as such, where moral problems are only a small part of a far greater whole. The fleeting quality of time, the illusion of stability, the continual change of everything living, the puzzle of a human mind seated in an animal body, these are the themes of the work, whose unity comes about through the fact that its hero is himself, the central symbol of life in all these aspects. So that is quite a mouthful right there, and I would love to hear what you think about it, as I would love to hear what you think about Faust itself, if you have any favorite translations, for example, or anything like that. But one thing that we can know for sure is that part 2 is much more universal. Okay, we're taking things to a different level right here. It is less subjective than part 1, and I think it is in fact part 2 that takes Faust from being a good book to being a great book. So as a bottom line, let me say something that I don't think needs to be said, but I still want to say it. This video is just an introduction to a very complex work. I have read Faust twice, different translations. I have read about it, the criticism, much of the criticism at least, and all that, and I still feel that I have seen only a glimpse of its greatness, okay? And I think, isn't this always the case with great works? When you read, for example, Don Quixote or The Divine Comedy, that's the same thing that happened to me when I experienced those books. Even though I may have gotten a little bit more from Don Quixote, a little bit more from The Divine Comedy for cultural reasons, for, translation reasons, or just because I am the person that I am. But I think that like them, okay, like Don Quixote, like The Divine Comedy, Faust is really an inexhaustible source. Okay, I think that is one of the reasons why it's messy, for example, or why many people have said that it has a messy structure. But let me say just one more thing about that precisely, and this is where I'm going to end this video that has already gone for much too long, maybe. I think that you could say Faust is maybe not cohesive, but it is definitely coherent. Okay, this is a book that basically creates its own rules and follows its own rules, like all great works of art. So we cannot judge it by pre-established notions. It has to be judged within the rules that it establishes for itself. And I think that is maybe the best way to approach a work like this one. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on Faust by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, as translated by David Constantine. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.